I'm thrilled to welcome all of you to this wonderful donor appreciation evening for our Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta. I'm Ann Kramer, and I happen to serve in multiple roles. As they say, FOA, Friends of Alicia, first and foremost. I also get to be a member of our board of directors, and for many of you who are in here who have served in the past and who are currently serving, we're so grateful. And also for the rest of us who are the we in this room, who are those donors, and to you we are so grateful. So it is so much fun for me to be the one that gets, as we would say, gets to welcome you on behalf of the Community Foundation's board and all of us who benefit from your generosity in our community. We certainly tonight have so many reasons to celebrate. It makes me want to just burst with pride. Our first is, Michael K., you're going to love this one. I know, not that he doesn't care, but pre-audited estimates of our last year's totals will absolutely blow you away. And for me, because I get to serve in a broader range with the Council on Foundations, is when I see what our community foundation is doing, we all want to shout with joy. We received approximately, get this, $197 million in gifts from donors and other funders in 2013, which makes that the largest percentage and the number of gifts that we've ever received. Woohoo! 63 years of history. So it's you, to you, and with you. We thank you and are so deeply appreciative. It not only deserves that round of applause, but it also, for you within your heart, is really the undergirding of that generosity that so reflects our community, and you are it, so thank you. And also, last year, not only did we receive that income, the granting in the community for those enormous needs that all of us are so aware within the social justice issues and other community impact areas that we gave approximately $131 million to nonprofits in our Atlanta region and beyond. And that, again, makes 2013 one of the largest years ever in terms of the gift into the community. So that, too, gets an applause. You can tell. Round of applause. So in fact, as we would say, you were the 92% of all the grants that were issued in that year, 2013. It came from you, the donors. That is you, we, me, all of us. And it was your donor advised funds that were that generous gift to our community. So you too deserve. So we say received, outgoing, but even more importantly, the generation that you presented to our community, that deserves a round of applause. Woo-hoo. Okay, so it's thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And as you know, I would love to hug each one of you. But it really does make that our community foundation is your partner in philanthropy. And it really does enhance for us what we want to increase the quality of life for every citizen within our community. And I, of course, like to say it's not just with our citizens, but it's for every child, every person who is within our demographic region that we want to enhance their capacity to be those just like you, interdependent, contributing citizens. So within our metro region and beyond, you are making a difference, we are making a difference, and collectively we're creating an impact that really will enhance the quality of life for all of those people, whether they are, quote, documented or undocumented citizens. But it does really reflect for real, and I do have that pleasure of serving on our board, where we look at the 23 county region and find ways to really create those avenues in every one of our counties to make a difference. It really does. You make a difference. So for me, I say thank you. But like you, I am passionate about the community and making that philanthropic gift. Jeff and I, a long time ago, made the commitment, as you all know, where's George? Where's George and Janet? Many, like 45 years ago, made the commitment to, one, be rooted in the community, and two, be contributing in our community. And gratefully, we have the Community Foundation through which we, Jeff and Ann, Will and Megan, and now Lauren, can make that kind of official contribution. It makes such a difference because within that framework, yes, we have our choice to those organizations that we care deeply about, from the rootedness of our St. Luke's, our faith community, to all of those organizations that we have cared deeply about over time, from the United Way to the Woodruff Arts Center and all those things that we care about. But it's only through the Community Foundation that we can provide that kind of physical gift that really does cross the whole community to enhance that quality of life. And it's so from us to you and for you, we decided that we wanted to make a donor advised fund, small as it is, and I realize small as it is. It does, for me and for Jeff and for Megan and Will and Lauren, become the symbol of being a part of a physical community, that we want to be a part of that community that demonstrates its philanthropic generosity that does enhance who we are, what we want, and how we can become a community that cares. And it's only through our Community Foundation that we can exhibit that comprehensive commitment. And so, like you, we are so grateful because you have made that same commitment to create for our community a collective value add, which looks like real dollars, that makes that kind of comprehensive commitment to our community to create a collective impact. So from us to you, from Jeff and Ann to all of you, joining us in that larger largesse of resources that really does make a difference, we're grateful. So tonight we have a wonderful program of colleagues, friends, and long-term, this is such a cute group, I love this group, of friends that we have known for a long time who have been here, done that, and made a difference. It is such a joy for me to not only welcome you, but ask you to engage with us as we continue the journey of making a difference in our community through our Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta. With that, my dear Barrett, it's a joy to welcome you to the stage, Barrett Kreis, who is our philanthropic advisor from the Community Foundation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, darling.
Thank you so much, Ann. We so appreciate you saying such wonderful words about the Community Foundation. So I want to thank you all for joining us tonight for our panel discussion on philanthropy and the past and the future of the Atlanta region. After tonight's program, I hope you will take advantage of the special tours that Sheffield and his staff have arranged of the collection storage underneath the History Museum. It's not something that everybody gets to see, and it's a pretty unique opportunity, and I hope y'all will be able to stay around and take part in that. We've got some amazing panelists, clearly, you can see them next to me, who just happen to be donors and fund advisors of the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta. Each one of these donors is making a difference in shaping Atlanta through philanthropy and service. Our panelists are Tom Glenn, Karen Webster Parks, and A.J. Robinson. I would say more about them, but the entire program is going to be about them, and so I'll let Cliff take the honors of really introducing who our panelists are. But our panel's discussion will be moderated by Dr. Cliff Kuhn, Executive Director of the Oral History Association and Associate Professor of History at Georgia State University, who will also be making some remarks tonight. Dr. Kuhn is the author of numerous books and articles on Atlanta history, including Living Atlanta, An Oral History of the City, 1914 through 1948, and Contesting the New South Order, the 1914-1915 strike at Atlanta's Fulton Mills. He has been involved with many oral and public history efforts, including the award-winning Living Atlanta and Will the Circle Be Unbroken radio series. And, you may have caught him earlier this week, he does a monthly feature on this day in Atlanta history at WABE 90.1. So you'll recognize his voice if maybe you don't yet recognize his face. He's received numerous prestigious awards and has served as the co-chair of the Content Council for the National Center of Civil and Human Rights, which is getting ready to open, so I know all of you have that on your calendar as well. He also, and this is my favorite thing, and I'm going to take you up on this one of these days, he offers walking tours of downtown sites related to the 1906 Atlanta race riots on the second Sunday of each month. So sign up for those. I know they're amazing. I've read the book, and I really want to go do that with you. So now, it is my great pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Cliff Kuhn and our panelists.
Well, it is my great pleasure and an honor to be here. My thanks to Alicia and Barrett for putting this program together. My thanks also to Sheffield Hale for hosting us. And for those of you who have not been to the Atlanta History Center, this place is undergoing all sorts of tremendous changes under Sheffield's leadership, really expanding into new directions in terms of presentation. The forthcoming signature exhibit that's in the works right now, when it opens up in a couple of years, will be astounding, and I really appreciate all that Sheffield has done as well as head of the Atlanta History Center. We have a great panel tonight. Each of the individuals here on the panel has really contributed to the city in innumerable ways, not only through engagement, active engagement with the Community Foundation, through philanthropic circles, but also on countless boards and countless other arenas of civic engagement. And riddled throughout each of their stories is also the story of Atlanta. And so what we're going to do tonight is kind of have a roundtable discussion where we talk both about our panelists' individual trajectories and also with Atlanta always as a backdrop as well. Sort of how do these personal individual stories intersect with the story of our city, or I should say the stories of our city. We are going to go in order of the family's presence in Atlanta. And so we're going to start out with Tom Glenn to my immediate left, whose family has been in Atlanta since well back in the 19th century and has been a prominent Atlanta family since well back in the 19th century. The name Glenn, if you think about it, dots good portions of the Atlanta landscape. His grandfather, T.K. Glenn, Thomas K. Glenn, and I have to admit, reading the newspapers of 100 years ago, he's always referred to as T.K. Glenn and rarely as Thomas K. Glenn, was a high executive with the Georgia Electric and Railway Association company, which was the forerunner of Georgia Power, on the board of directors of Coca-Cola, a high executive with Atlantic Steel. In short, you can kind of get a sense that his own family was very much involved with many of the institutions that shaped Atlanta. Tom himself is now most centrally involved after a career in banking with the Glenn Family Foundation and has been involved in numerous philanthropic efforts. And last but not least is an avid bluegrass fan and musician as well. To his left is Karen Webster Parks, a native of Atlanta also, whose parents were in Boston and were introduced to each other by another young couple in Boston, Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, when Karen's parents were in attendance at Boston University at the same time that Martin Luther King was pursuing his doctorate, and came to Atlanta. Her father had already attended Morehouse, and her father worked in compliance for HUD, the Department of HUD, and her mother, Isabel Gates Webster, was a pioneering female African-American attorney. The Webster name also dots the Atlanta landscape. There is a park in southwest Atlanta called Isabel Gates Webster Park. Ironically, it is right at the corner of Peyton Road, and some of you remember the infamous Peyton Wall from 1962, when the city, in one of its less glorious moments, tried to erect a barrier blocking black residents from entering an previously all-white area of town. So I encourage you to go to Isabel Gates Webster Park in southwest Atlanta and see the wonderful sculpture that's there as well. Isabel Gates Webster was a pioneering attorney and won some very important employment lawsuits against MARTA and the Georgia Power Company that really opened the door for black employment at the upper levels of there's a conversation right there. There we go. And we're off. And Karen, in her own right, has continued in this tradition. Among other things, she's been a Fulton County Commissioner. She was CEO for a while of Literacy Action, one of my favorite organizations, the Atlanta Women's Foundation, many other organizations, and has her own firm engaged specifically in corporate philanthropy and leadership. Finally, to my far left is A.J. Robinson, who is the one non-Atlantan of the group. Most of you know A.J. He was a native of Knoxville, came here to go to school at Emory in 1973, graduated in 77, then went to a place called Harvard University. After working a year back in Knoxville,
How did you remember all this stuff?
it's my job. Around 1980 or 81, after graduating from Harvard, he went to work for Portman Properties and was very much involved with Portman's expansion into Singapore and Hong Kong over much of the next 22 or 23 years. Since 2003, AJ has been looking over Central Atlanta progress and very much involved with CAP's role in the downtown, all sorts of downtown developments, including, of course, the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, which will open in about 2 or 3 weeks. So all of these panelists have different paths, but they all share a great deal in common, and that's what we're going to be kind of exploring this evening. I've asked each of them to start out with an opening kind of question, which is to describe sort of family values within your own family, and to kind of talk about what you learned in your family and your community and elsewhere that perhaps led you towards a life of civic engagement and philanthropy. And perhaps also to provide a snapshot of Atlanta when you, Tom, or you, Karen, were children, and AJ when you came to Emory in the 70s. So we'll start with Tom.
Okay, thank you, Cliff. Very quickly, I'll say that it is heartwarming to be in a room like this with so many people who've done so much for this area and who care about Atlanta history. It's pretty neat. Family values earlier on that had some effect. 3 things come to mind. First, both my parents were born in 1906 and 1911, so they grew up during the Depression, and there was a strong sense in the family about the needs of others and about pain and suffering and helping other folks and dealing with the issues of that era. That's one. Another is I grew up in rural and relatively poor Sandy Springs. That was out in the country back then. There's not a joke here. Some of you may know where Mount Vernon Highway in Sandy Springs crosses Roswell Road. Well, between there and Buckhead, there was only one traffic light. That was at West Wyuka. Hammond Drive was a dirt road. But back to the point, I can remember my 1st and 2nd grade teachers taking a student off to the cafeteria in the morning when they realized that little boy, that little girl had not had breakfast. So it was a relatively, it was not a very affluent area back in those days. That made an effect on me. And then you referred to my grandfather earlier. I was constantly hearing stories that my father would tell about my grandfather, about his interest in other people, about his love of people, about his desire to help folks out. So I would say those are the 3. Now, snapshots, do you want to take care of that later, or do you want...
Well, why don't we start now and then go to the snapshots? I should say that Tom's grandfather, shortly before his death, 1946, was the person who put together the idea for Grady Hospital to be governed by the Fulton DeKalb Hospital Authority. You know, again, shortly before he died in 1946, your grandfather came up with this changing the administration of Grady Hospital so it was connected with Fulton and DeKalb County. So Karen. Okay.
So I grew up in the 60s, and I had people laughing because I grew up and I was a child that they used to experiment on all the time. We were from, of course, both of my parents were in the household and both had graduate degrees, and both told us that we would go to college and you would get a graduate degree, so you just knew that was just something that you did in life. And then they also reminded us that we were blessed, and as a responsibility of being blessed, you had to give back. But I said the reason why it was an experiment is because they would do things like they would send us to camp with Jewish kids, which was unheard of during that time. I don't know if you know Camp Blue Star. But we didn't know we didn't know that we were being an experiment. This was the first time that black kids and Jewish kids were together, and we had fun, like kids going to camp. And then later on, one of the people that I went to camp with came to me later on and said, we have some friends that just want to get together because we can't afford to give money away, so we want to volunteer our time. And that's how Hands On Atlanta was created by 13 friends who just got together. We weren't trying to do anything, we were just trying to be friends. And our first executive of Hands On Atlanta was Michelle Nunn. So you just see how things just kind of happen. It's not rocket scientist stuff. You know, we were based with the same sort of basic principles that everyone talked about at dinner time. You give back, you make a difference, you count your blessings. Don't ever think that you're better than anybody. My father always told me there's always going to be someone smarter and better looking than you, so you better work hard. And so with those basic values, that's how we got here.
In the email, Karen, you were saying that your mother was involved in these lawsuits. It was in a form of community service in its own right.
Yes.
Want to speak to that?
Well, not only that, my grandfather was an attorney too, and his uncle was an attorney, so my mother was third generation, so that was just unheard of. And at that time, for some reason, they didn't think that women should be attorneys. And so she would get clients, and quite often they couldn't afford to pay her. So they would pay her with hams and turkeys or, you know, just that kind of stuff. So, you know, it was kind of like community service for not only during the civil rights movement, when people were getting arrested, one of the stories I heard is they slid my mother down the laundry chute because there weren't that many people that could get them out of jail. They were practicing law at that time. And so she did this, you know, just as a community service because that's what she was supposed to do.
AJ.
Okay, so I'm the different one here, the outcast. Only been here since '73. So my family grew up in Knoxville, you know, the bustling Jewish community of Knoxville, Tennessee. Grandparents on both sides were immigrants from Europe, like most Jewish folks who've come here in the last 150 years. They came around the turn of the century. And, you know, really small town, university town. My father, what I inherited from him was just work ethic. He had nothing after the war, started a business. His business was his whole life. There was nothing else. As it's true of most people, a lot of folks who had nothing after the war and came back and said, what I do now, didn't have a college education. My mother, on the other hand, was this mix. She was a fancy woman from Atlanta. And they had gotten fixed up on some kind of blind date. I never had quite understood that whole story. But Atlanta was the big city for Knoxville. You know, East Tennessee kind of, Chattanooga kind of, folks come to Atlanta, and then Nashville folks go towards Memphis. So we kind of gravitated to Atlanta. I guess my father and mother met that way. But from her, I inherited this very conscientious community ethic. I remember helping people. I remember going with her, serving like Meals on Wheels when I was like 6 years old and carrying stuff into houses or going. She was like one of the first people that ever recycled anything. Remember when you used to take your recycling to a parking lot and there was like a truck there? You know, I think she still does that. She's 89 years old. She had in Knoxville, they don't have recycling bins yet, I don't think. But anyway, I think that that's this combination of a business person with maybe a community conscience. And just a little known fact, I think my mother's the only person I know who voted for Shirley Chisholm in the presidential election. So my father probably voted for Reagan every time.
It would have been Nixon.
Exactly.
Well, let's describe the Atlanta, either of your childhood or when you came to Atlanta, AJ. If you could think of perhaps an episode or epitomizing kind of story that sort of sums up the Atlanta that you encountered, as a young person?
Well, I came to Emory in '73 before the Woodruff gift. There was nothing. It was Emory. There wasn't much there. But I had a unair-conditioned dorm room as a freshman. I'll never forget that. But one of the things that really symbolizes, I think, and I tell this story, I've introduced John Portman many times around the world. At that time, you remember '73, there wasn't much skyline. Skyline, there wasn't many tall buildings, but I could see out of my dorm room this tall thing, round thing being built. And for a year and a half, I watched it keep going up and up. And I always tell folks, either whoever's building this has got to be the craziest person in the world or brilliant, right? So to me, if I look back on that era, that Atlanta was really on the move. If you remember, after civil rights, the 70s, 80s, you had these developers and folks. You had Portman and Cousins and Ted Turner and all these folks coming to town or were already here. And that building probably symbolized more of to me, the aspiration of Atlanta and the hope of Atlanta in a real physical way. When the Peachtree Plaza, now the Westin, was open, tallest hotel in the world. And to me, again, as a young person coming in '73, I always felt like, well, if I can get out of college, then maybe this would be the place, to come back to.
I also moved to Atlanta in 1973. It was a very yeasty place, was the word I would describe it. Maynard Jackson was elected right around that time. Major League Sports had come here. The skyline of downtown was beginning to change. Just an enormously dynamic, vibrant, complicated place. I remember the first night I came here, I went to Underground Atlanta, and I turned around and there's Lester Maddox selling axe handles out of the stall in Underground the very first night I arrived in Atlanta. So it's a very complicated place as it is today, but a very yeasty would be the word I would use. Very vibrant new city charter right around that time, and a very dynamic place.
And MARTA was coming.
And MARTA was right out in the corner, right? Carter was just making his move to the White House and so forth. So it epitomizes a kind of recollection of Atlanta.
The same for me. Now, how many native Atlantans are in the audience? Oh, okay, that's good to know, because I grew up when the public school system worked. I'm a graduate of the Atlanta public school system. And at that time, you hear this whole talk about the village. It was just phenomenal that if I did anything, that those teachers somehow got in contact with my parents before I got home. And it's just that sort of connectivity that the teachers, the principals, everyone was really concerned about how we were going to act and how we were going to develop, and then the role that we were going to take in society. And this was something that was, just taught to us every day in the public school system. And then as the 70s came, I don't know how many of you remember M2M program with the Atlanta Public School Systems. So once again, I'm being that experimental child that we didn't know because we didn't have any problems. So for some reason, Atlanta didn't have that many problems, and I'm not sure, you probably know more than I do, when the schools were being integrated. And even to this day, some of my friends that I stay in contact with are people that we went through integration together. And the city was going through some really interesting things. You talk about Lester Maddox, and I remember my mom telling me how much Lester Maddox did for blacks folks, and she was an appointee of Jimmy Carter, and how he had to say some things publicly, but behind the scenes, when you looked at his records and the people that he was appointing, you'll see a different story. And so one of the things I got from there, and one of the things I got as I was older, is that I would listen to what people would say, but I would watch their actions. And I found out more and more, sometimes the actions were a little bit different from what had to be said to keep the community sort of still at peace at that time. But I grew up 60s and 70s, and we really didn't have any trouble. We all felt that we had the same sort of things, same sort of values. We wanted the same sort of things. We wanted the same sort of quality of life issues. And so what made us different was your determination to do better.
when you use the word, excuse me, snapshot, there are actually a few photographs from that era that pop out in my mind. Frankly, not all of them good. There was the shot in Look magazine of the 707 at the end of the field at Orly, where something like 106 Atlantans lost their lives. I had a couple of friends whose parents perished in that accident, and that obviously had an enormous impact on the Atlanta philanthropic community, because so many of those people were members of the Atlanta Art Association. Another photograph I remember is one of Ivan Allen Jr. on top of a car with a bullhorn in his hand down in Summerhill in the middle of a riot. There's a long story about that, much that can be said. And then Lester Maddox has been mentioned a couple of times tonight. I remember a photograph of him standing before a mannequin that he had lying in a fake coffin. You're stealing my thunder here, Cliff. I mean, hey, Cliff does know all this stuff. What a resource. But he was, Lester was there with this mannequin on the fake coffin, protesting the federal government's stand on integration, and he had this caption printed out beneath the coffin: the death of the free enterprise system. Something vaguely familiar about that. But at any rate, those were the things that, Anne, leave that glass of wine alone. Some things that really stick out in my mind. But Kate, you said something that actually brings back a memory that I'd forgotten about. I do, now that you mention it, recall African Americans in that era saying some good things about Lester Maddox. I mean, for all else that was there, I think one of the lines that I heard was, "You always knew where he stood." But yeah, and I think you know, there's good in everyone. But those are the items that stand out in my mind.
Interestingly, given your own family's connection with Atlantic Steel, Lester Maddox's father worked at Atlantic Steel, and Lester Maddox worked at Atlantic Steel, and it is absolutely true. He went to bat for two black men who had been fired because they chose to join a labor union. And Lester Maddox did feel that was unfair, and he went to bat for these two African-American men who got fired because they joined the CIO at Atlantic Steel, probably in the 40s, I would say. So it is a complicated world that we live in. We could go on about it. Atlanta, the 60s, and the snapshots you just mentioned are incredibly powerful shots. I interviewed Dan Sweat once, and he worked for Ivan at that time of the Summerhill riot, and he recalled Ivan Allen coming into the City Hall the next day wearing shin guards around his knees, around his shins, because his shins had been so blistered during that episode. They were blistered, and he was in pain and came into work the next day wearing shin guards to City Hall. And of course, the Orly crash was one of these landmark events, and just sent a thunderclap through the Atlanta community. Mayor Allen, of course, also personal friends of many of the people who perished. And certainly, I know, Tom, you've written about the magic of the 60s and the boldness and the leadership of Ivan Allen, and it certainly was true that he exhibited tremendous leadership. Probably his defining moment was speaking in Congress on behalf of the public accommodation section of the forthcoming Civil Rights Act, thinking that it was going to be his political death, and sort of surprised that he won re-election after that. And almost certainly he showed, and he grew himself in his encounters with the students who were sitting in the summer in the 1961, and was sensitized and showed real leadership. I'd like to now maybe shift a little bit and kind of talk about the path that led you personally into kind of
a career of philanthropy, civic engagement, service to the community, how you entered that world, how you learned the ropes, who were your mentors, what was the philanthropic scene like when you kind of entered that world here in Atlanta, whenever you did?
For me, it had to do with the death of my parents when they died and some estate planning that we were doing. And so I just decided that that was the direction that I wanted to head in. But the real point I would like to make here is how incredibly accommodating the Atlanta philanthropic community is. Everyone from whom I asked advice was so helpful. And that has stayed the same. There are, as new foundations come on board, they typically go to some of the masters in town, to John Stevenson, to Russ Hart and Pete McTeer, Bobby Cleveland, Alicia Phillip. And these people are always rolling out the welcome mat, telling you anything you want to know, making it so much easier. And I think that it speaks so well for the philanthropic community that we have in Atlanta.
I think with me, it started as a child, and we were given an allowance, and our parents made us give a certain percent of our allowance to church, then another percentage of our allowance we had to give back to the community, and then the rest we could do what we want. So that 50 cents went a real long way a couple of times, but it was just something that they started us really young, that a certain percentage, would go to church, community, and then the rest to yourself. And then you heard me talk about Hands on Atlanta. And, at that stage, we were all in our 20s, and we didn't have any money. But what we felt was more valuable was giving back our time. And so we decided that we would give our time, and then eventually that would hopefully turn into giving money.
Let's follow up the early days of Hands on Atlanta. What was that like, really building a very powerful organization today from the ground, and some of sort of the early stories of step-by-step building of Hands on Atlanta, if you will?
Well, it started with 13 of us, and we were anywhere from our late 20s to our early 30s. And so at that time, you all sort of started your profession, so we didn't have a penny to our names, but we knew that this was a city that had a reputation of giving back. I think at the time when you would probably know better, the city too busy to hate and all of that, but that was something that was ingrained in all of us, that we had a responsibility to give back to the community. Well, we didn't have a dime, but we had our time. And so what we did is that we would go to different organizations, and the first was the Atlanta Food Bank, and volunteer our time. And we're like, oh, we can do this, so why didn't everybody ask 10 of their friends to come back the next time? And it just kept growing and growing. And there was the Days Inn family donated space to us. And then eventually we just kept growing and growing. We said, oh, we may need an executive director to run this, because we were all working at that time, and it just sort of took off from that. Because again, when we would go out to the communities to solicit, we would say to people of our generation, we're not asking you for a dime. What we're asking you is for your time and for you to give back to the community. And it was phenomenal how many people wanted to give back.
Yeah, let me just go back in that, because one snapshot I want to share really has to do is for those of you who, you always had this idea, particularly in the South, that you had to come through Atlanta if you were flying, right? So one of the snapshots I just want to share is that something about Atlanta was so dynamic. Every time you came through the airport, it was like a different airport in the 80s, right? It had a different one of those pods, that you used to go out to, and it just kept getting, and then eventually took all that down and built another thing. So I think one of the things we really take for granted here for many years historically has been that huge engine that now everybody is biggest in the world, most passengers or whatever. But as Atlanta grew, I think part of our history really is tied to that airport. But for me, the philanthropy started very young. Whether it's family tradition, Jewish causes, non-Jewish causes, it was a mix of everything. One of the things that impressed me when I came here in terms of that I learned early on working for Portman and being part of the kind of the business community here in the 70s, early 80s, is that it was kind of part of the culture here, that the business community was not only a big driver of what happened, but really cared for the community in a different way. And I think it's one of the real legacies that probably began back in the Hartsfield days or whenever it did. But what we also learned, and many of you may know, we don't have really good government in Georgia on any level. And out of self-interest, if you really wanted to get something done, as a business leader, you had to figure out a way to get it done. And I can tell you, it's still that way today. Occasionally, we have good leaders, and when you have good leaders, you really have to get a lot done because they don't last that long. I think one of the things there is this inherent, and there's always a tug between profitable businesses and nonprofits, but I think a lot of people take for granted literally that this business community platform that we have here. So we've always been this city of opportunity where people have moved here from all over to seek their fortune.
And that goes way back till after the Civil War, where the timing of Atlanta's founding was important because it was an inland city precisely as the nation was moving to rail. So the Atlantas and Nashvilles and Chicagos of the world become the dynamic cities, and the older maritime cities are more static, the Charlestons and Mobiles in that period after the Civil War. And Tom and I were actually talking about this on the phone, the contrast to Birmingham, which at some level was an absentee town, where you had U.S. Steel executives, Tennessee Coal and Iron executives from Pittsburgh in Birmingham, but not as attached to a place as their counterparts here. And, I was thinking about Birmingham and something else you just said, because historians might point to a date in the 20s as one of the seminal events in Atlanta's history, which was when Atlanta got the airmail route for the Southeast through Atlanta rather than Birmingham. And Birmingham was every bit as much of a new South city as Atlanta, had equivalent population, economic dynamo in the 20s. But there was a cluster of foresighted politicians and business people here, including Mayor Hartsfield, who was on the Board of Aldermen's Aviation Committee in the 1920s, who basically out-hustled Birmingham and got wine to dine the Secretary of, I think, the Interior, Secretary of Commerce, I guess, and lo and behold, the airmail route came through Atlanta rather than through Birmingham. It really is one of those defining moments in the city that nobody really knows about. And this group, I think it's very appropriate that our airport is named after both Mayor Hartsfield, who had an abiding interest in aviation, and Mayor Jackson, who also had an abiding interest in the airport as well. And both of them, really were identified with the growth of the airport. So I'd be curious about the choice. Yeah. Oh, I'm told we have 5 minutes, more or less. So we just got started. We do want to open it up to question and answer. We know that there are people in the audience with a great deal to share too about Atlanta's history. So let's move to a kind of a concluding question. I really apologize for that. But let's talk about sort of the evolution of your personal philanthropy, the things you're associated with, and then the evolution as you've seen it over the decades of the philanthropic community in Atlanta more generally, okay? And we can kind of maybe intermingle your own story with this larger picture of philanthropic community in Atlanta.
Don't wait on the questions, you know.
Go ahead. No, we'll answer this question first, and then we'll open it up.
Well, where earlier Atlanta is concerned, 5 Points was not only a banking hub, it was pretty much the center of finance in the Southeast. And the banks were CNS, First National, Trust Company, Fulton National, NBG. And the heads of those banks were involved with virtually every aspect of civic engagement, along with the heads of John H. Harlan, Genuine Parks, Atlantic Steel, which is no longer. As far as an evolution is concerned, the corporations, the big business people in Atlanta are extremely philanthropic today. But a big difference, I think, is that the city is far more transient than it was back then. Most of the heads of the businesses I refer to were either had been Atlanta residents for a long time, or they had come from somewhere relatively close by. And I think that their roots were much deeper, and their emotional commitment to what happened here was much more sincere. So I don't bemoan where we are now. I think we have so much to be thankful for where philanthropic support is concerned, at the corporate level in particular. But it's different. There was so much that a relatively small nucleus of people could get done so expeditiously. But that's my recollection.
Ivan Allen had the famous quote, we all grew up together, we all attended the same churches, the same clubs, and we were all as dedicated to Atlanta as a Boy Scout is to drinking milk, or something like that. So,
Karen.
And from as long as I can remember, my parents were involved in the not-for-profit world with the NAACP, the Urban League, and they always needed money. And I can always just remember them fundraising and saying that, you know, if they had a blank check, some of the things they would do. And for me, individually, I was a public official. I was one of those short-termers, and hopefully one of the good ones that you were thinking about.
She appointed me to it.
And by the blessing, you know, we had money left over. And so instead of spending the money for my campaign, I rolled it over into a fund. And so continued to add on to it, because that was my thing, as opposed to just wasting the money. I felt that it would be a wonderful thing to give back to the community. So I'm not sure if many elected officials have done that. But
like Barbara Asher, I think, are the only two.
But, you know, so that was one of the reasons that I did that. And as an adult now, and you may not want to hear me saying this, but I like to do acts of kindness.
Yeah.
And there are times that I do, and I like to do anonymous gifts now, and acts of kindness. And I have found that to be almost full cycle, how rewarding these acts of kindness are.
AJ, sort of Atlanta now compared to
Yeah,
Atlanta?
sure, but let me just first say, she appointed me to a job, Fulton County Development Authority, and then she lost her election and they fired me from the You know that, right? So Tom, I'll give you hope. My office is still down there at 5 Points, although the banks have left, but we're still down there. So just my own, I guess, journey changed a lot when I took this job at CAP and became worried about everything about Atlanta. And more out of necessity, but more out of, I just saw more. I spent most of my 23 years with Portman on an airplane someplace, building projects around the world, and then I think in some respects inherited John Portman's passion for Atlanta. Not necessarily to build every building, but he does have an unbelievable passion for the city of Atlanta and expressed it through everything he's done here. But in the work at CAP, it's just you see a whole lot more. You see a whole lot more need. You see people like Alicia and what the foundation has done, and Ann Kramer and her. I see Ann Kramer like every day. And Tom Glenn, who's just unbelievable in what they've done. So as a former kind of business leader and now a kind of different kind of business leader, you really see the needs of the community in a different way, not all financial, quite honestly, much more really just about as Atlanta has changed and become this very complicated place of 6 million people. To me, the real challenge for all of us, but particularly what I do, is to get people to care about what was really the original Atlanta in a way that it's changing. And people who've moved here in the last 20, 30 years, even folks like me, we don't have that necessarily get that secret sauce of what makes Atlanta
So
special.
how do you meet that challenge?
Well, the first thing everyone here has to do is to go to the Center for Civil and Human Rights, because not only is it a history lesson for people who lived here and lived through it, but it's really a special place. And I'm just, this is a shameful commercial, but we've all been involved in it, and Tom and I went through yesterday on a preview tour, and it's just fantastic. So everything we've been talking about, and you know Cliff has been involved in since the very beginning, a lot of this stuff is chronicled in that thing, as it is chronicled here, but it's chronicled in a different way, because it somehow bridges the past with much more about the future and special. But this ability to somehow, transfer people's caring and passion about Atlanta is a full-time job, and there's a lot of people doing it. But to me, being able to just do one person, if everybody can just pull one person into what you all do for the community and the foundation, and get people jazzed up about how they can change the world here in Atlanta, I think that's everybody's responsibility.
Let's thank our panel. And let's open it up to not only questions, but comments of your own. So if people, yes.
That's all I have was reminded of is the day that Ivan Allen called Bill Sweeney to see that bank and said, Hosea Williams is going to be marching through your bank at noon today. And Bill said with this wonderful World Ties, so everybody came in. What he was protesting was they didn't have any African-American tellers. Well, I found out later from Mr. Layton that Ivan used to meet in the northwest corner of the varsity parking lot with Hosea at 5:30 in the morning. So you wonder why Atlanta didn't have a lot of problems with Birmingham and some of them had, is that we had a fantastic leader in Ivan Allen, and the civil rights people at that time trusted him.
And similarly, I mentioned this a year ago at the CAP breakfast, that Dan Sweat and Maynard Jackson were public enemies in the press. But in the interviews that I did with Dan Sweat shortly before he died, he talked about how he and Maynard would talk on the phone every single day. And Dan would say, talk to the businessmen and call them up. Call up 10 businessmen in downtown. He said, one will have a heart attack when you call, but the other 9 will be at least attentive to you and listen to you. So yeah, I think there were those behind the scenes relationships that actually go back to 1906, you could argue, or 1919. Way back, there was a tradition of sometimes fragile, always imperfect communication across the color line. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
I don't know that I can reach each other. I'll try.
Yes.
You mentioned Atlanta Airport. Atlanta Airport has not moved in many, many years in terms of being one of the most tobacco polluted airports in the world. Now, how in the world, and the history is pretty simple. The tobacco companies came in, they bought the airport management, and it's been impossible, even though the CD studies have shown that the particulate matter in the corridors of the airport are higher here. Most airports in the country do not have this. My question is, how can we move Atlanta on this issue?
I leave this to the panels. Not for the historians.
Well, there's hope. We just got free Wi-Fi this week in the airport. Look, we were joking this week. We reopened the Polaris Lounge at the top of the Hyatt, which was 1967. and a couple of us are there. And what was the big difference? Well, you can actually see the other people. There was so much smoke in 1967. So, you know, I think the airport is, you know, there's so many people come through there, and there are still a lot of people who smoke, and you can't just put them all out on the curb and let them, because they got airplanes to catch. So they struggle with that issue. I know they struggle with that issue, and I think over the time, I think you know, maybe you won't see smokers, but until there's just nobody smoking in a public place, it's tough. I mean, we just last year banned smoking in Woodruff Park, which was, and now all the parks in Atlanta followed us. So it's just one of those things that society takes a long time to change.
I really love this panel. You give so many different perspectives to our history. And like the gentleman on the end, I came in '78, but I love this city and I am very connected to my community. I'd be interested in hearing from each of you where you feel the most impact for philanthropy can be in the next 10 years, but not just in the city of Atlanta. I want to expand it just to say in the Atlanta area, where do you feel that the biggest impact can come for philanthropy?
Look, Tom, you were.
And that's one of the things that my husband and I have struggled with. And I hope I'm not offending anyone by saying what I'm getting ready to say, but we have found that a lot of the problems that we're having now go back to the family unit. And you heard me say that for some reason the Atlanta public school system worked when we were growing up, and what were those things that, why did it work? Why isn't it working now? And a lot of things that we see, and this is a long response to your answer, goes back to a lot of what the family unit is looking like now and what is actually happening in those family units. And one of your first questions that you asked us about were our core values and our beliefs. And so one of the things that we try to look at is organizations that are trying to just put the basics back into place, basic values, and not trying to be too religious, but some of the things just, you know, one of the most important charge that I'm given in my faith is to love the other person. And it's just something that simple that we're just not doing. We're not loving ourselves, we're not loving each other, and we're not loving the community. And so I think that what we have to do now is focus more and more on what the community is, but break it down to what that family is doing it, and then how are we supporting these entities to make that community back to where it was. Was that bland enough for you?
Well, for me, we should create more philanthropists. So whatever you can do to create, because I don't think the next generation gets it as much as people who were on the, you know, we're just on a different wavelength. So whatever, and I know the Community Foundation does a lot in this area of trying to create philanthropy as a something to do at a young age, but whatever we can do, and to be very selfish, I would say concentrated in the city of Atlanta, only because if we don't do really well here, it's not going to do really well out in the suburban thing. So to me, Atlanta always has to be the special light for the rest of the region. So if we don't get it right here, it isn't going to get right someplace else, and that's just a very selfish.
The issue of public education is about the most complicated issue I've ever encountered where philanthropic endeavor is concerned. Altruistic objectives aside, when a company thinks about headquartering somewhere, one of the first boxes they want to check is, what's the public education like? we've had our trials and tribulations here, Lord knows. But what the silver lining to the cloud is there's so many people, many more people talking about it now. 5 years ago, we weren't having the kind of conversations that we are now. And one other point in a more general, at a more general level, because communication, information technology is happening so rapidly, more people are going to learn about just how bad it is. APS 2013, we had right at 75% of the students were on free or reduced lunch. State of Georgia, 60%. I mean, really think about that for a minute. We've got 3 school systems in the state of Georgia where there are 100% of the students on free or reduced lunch. A lot of people don't know that. They just don't have a clue of really how bad things are out there. But I think that's going to change. I like to think it is. I think we're moving in that direction.
I see in the audience Nan and Britt Pendergrast. And Nan in 1958, 59, and 60 was a member of a group called HOPE, Help Our Public Education, because there existed the real threat that the entire school system in Atlanta and even the state of Georgia would be closed down rather than desegregated. And a group of women, including Nan, organized around the school system. And one of Nan's colleagues in the group, Hope, Frances Pauley, told me once that there were these 2 young people who started volunteering with the group, and she didn't know where they came from. She was a little bit suspicious about them. And it turned out that I think one was from AT&T and one was from IBM, perhaps, from major corporations that were thinking about moving to Atlanta and were afraid of moving to a situation that was so volatile over the school system where there existed the real likelihood. Governor Marvin Griffin said, if one black child enters Henry Grady High School, I'll close down all the schools. And under the 14th Amendment, there was the possibility that every single public school in the state would have closed down. And so there have been times when the business community and others, intervened in the schools, and we were not Little Rock, and we were not Birmingham, and we were not New Orleans in that regard.
We have time probably for one more question.
I just have a question for Cliff. For people who haven't lived in Atlanta for 30 years or 50 years, pick one book that you would recommend. Oh, yes.
As soon as better bookstores everywhere. Well, Sheffield knows the short list because I told them there's a short list. But my book is not bad. It's called Living Atlanta, an Oral History of the City, 1914 to 1948. And we interviewed, this is in the late 70s, about 200 Atlantans from not only prominent people like former Chief Jenkins, business leaders and others, but maids and streetcar men and textile workers, and put it into a sort of a composite of a book. More recently...
Well, and covering, okay, so 2 then. So after the also cover...
That's a good question. I mean, there are several contenders. Kevin Cruz's book, White Flight, is really important, a real important book. Obviously, Melissa Fay Green's book on the Temple bombing says a lot.
Gary Pomerantz.
Gary Pomerantz from Peachtree, Beach Street, Auburn. So those would be 3.
And I actually worked, remember when you and I collaborated on making a list for all of the Community Foundation staff? So when new staff start at the Community Foundation, one of the things we want to give them is this reading list. And we helped the Foundation Center Library buy the books so that people could go and use those books. So what I will do is we'll post on our website that list of books, because I worked with Cliff on what those books ought to be. Do you know what I mean? And so I can share that with you. Some great books.
And Sheffield has the short list as well. So if you go into the StoryCorps booth at the Atlanta History Center, I believe the list of primo books on Atlanta history is right behind your shoulder. So the History Center has a collection of them too. So great.
Wow.
Thank you for the question. And thank you for your time.
You guys are really all amazing. And I think it really exemplifies that philanthropy is about time, talent, and treasure. And I think you really talked about all of those aspects of it, but how grounded it is in each person's history and in each person's life and where they came from. But it's also really touched on by the history of this community. And we're very fortunate to be part of the Atlanta community and to have this in, even for a short time or a long time, in our DNA as we begin to do this philanthropy. So thank you all very much. The Community Foundation, as you all know, as donors, stands ready to help you in any way in your philanthropy. And some of the topics that they touched on tonight, like public education and things about interfaith and intercultural, are all aspects of the community that the Community Foundation is working on. And your philanthropic advisor would be happy to connect you in any way to some of those activities and things that we're doing in the community. So I want another big round of applause, and then I'm calling my buddy Sheffield up. And Sheffield, as you come up, thank you again for hosting us and allowing us to be here tonight at this wonderful facility. And you can now say a few words and then tell us how we're going to do these tours afterwards.
Okay, well, I'm not going to say anything other than to say what a wonderful group, and how important this is. And I really appreciate Ms. Pendergrass for not telling absolutely everybody here how I kicked her in the shins when I was 2 years old.
She told me, and I told
I know, and so I've broadcasted it again. But anyway, I appreciate y'all being here, and I won't talk about a lot what we're doing here at the History Center. Just watch us. I can talk about it, but watch what we do. And we're blowing this place up, and we're changing it. We're having a lot of fun, and you're going to want to come back and see things. There are going to be some programs for what's going on coming up this summer, our lectures, what we're doing around the Civil War 150th anniversary, our Georgia Public Television series, all that stuff. You can pick that stuff on the way out. But what I'd like to invite those who have the time or the inclination to do is to join me and Gordon Jones on a behind-the-scenes tour of our collection storage, where you can see 95% of what we have, only 5% is on display. And of course, what we'll do is divide up into two groups depending who they are. And one group can go with me for one part of it and do show and tell. And then the other group can go with Gordon and actually learn something. But we will just meet up in the lobby and broke into two groups. And thank y'all all for coming tonight. And hopefully y'all come back to some of our lectures and other things that are happening this summer. Thanks.